come when you know it. Just need a little help here. Part of the ministry of bishops is to part of the ministry of bishops is to bring the wider church to the local, and the local church to the wider, connect the two. I'm going to tell you what it was about yesterday. I think you need to know it. Is that we have a group in our diocese called the Enviro Action Group. This is a group of Christians from across the diocese who believe that part of the gospel imperative is to care for the created order that God has given us, and that the created order is in peril. And I think we all know that in the wider world with the environmental devastation, which is life is changing and the physical order is changing. So we have this group that's trying to stimulate Christians to reflect about this, because we believe theologically that God has said, we believe that God has created all that there is, and God saw the created order, and it is good, and that we have a responsibility to care for the created order, that we are connected and interconnected. And so we have this group that has been working diligently to try to raise consciousness within the Anglican family here. It's happening across the church, as it is happening across the spectrum of humanity. And so we have this group. We met yesterday for a day, a cleanup day, because it's right around Earth Day. So we met outside at a parish church called St. Stephens. It was snowing in London yesterday. It snowed there. What a downer. And of course the bishop was invited. You know, it's like the bishop comes, so this old bishop came, and we celebrated a wonderful Eucharist, young people and older people like me. And then we all went out with our boots and our coats, and special gloves were provided. We partnered with the Thames River Conservation Authority and went over to Springbank Park. You know Springbank Park? Gorgeous park in London. Walked along by the Springbank Dam and picked up junk like we would do. We saw more Tim Hortons cups. And every time someone picked one up, said, "Go up the wind." And then we said, we'll argue about who gets it. But that's what we did yesterday, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Oh, it was snowing and it was so cold. We all had tubes on. But we really felt that we were, I don't have my microphone on. I guess I should stick it on there. Is that better? Can you hear me now? All right, okay, sorry. We should have waited back there. Anyway, we did that. So I'm down here today to be with you folks, and after I have to leave in fairly good time, because I'm going back to, this gives you a sense of the diocese in our life as Christians is so much more than this parish church. And I remember when I served in parish communities, we tended to think myopically that we were the church. The church is so much more than just the congregation. It is that, but it's so much more. So at 3 o'clock today, I've got to zip back to London, and we're going to have a celebration at St.Stephens Memorial Church, which is just by the 401. To celebrate First Nations ministry in this diocese. And we're going to honor 2 of our leaders who have been doing this and working with First Nations Aboriginal Anglicans for years. The Father David Norton, you know Father David, he was 40 years ago. David has pretty well been around actually longer than I have in the diocese. And he's been passionate about, again, raising consciousness and issues within the church, in terms of our relationship and the lack thereof with First Nations communities. And so we're having a celebration to honor David and also the Reverend Laverne Jacobs. And Laverne is just retired as a national coordinator for First Nations ministries in the United Church of Canada, but before that he was with the Anglican Church of Canada, and Verne's a classmate. And so he's retired, so we're going to celebrate this. And so celebrate the huge impact that these 2 Christian leaders have had. That's not the homily. I'm sorry. I just sort of let you know kinds of things that I do. We are now in Easter. And Easter is so important in the lives of Christians that it's 50, we take 50 days. We say, we need to take 50 days to think about what God has done in the resurrected Christ. And so in the early days of the church's life, Easter was so important, they actually didn't do a confession. The church said, well, we're zeroing in on what God has done for us. So we'll just chuck that out. We can do that later. We're just going to sort of kind of get in the zone of God's action in Easter. And so the church takes this 50 days, and we're hearing in the Gospels particularly the resurrection appearances. We've been doing it ever since resurrection morning. And in the parish churches I served in, we always have at least one Easter hymn somewhere in there to celebrate the Easter dynamic. Now, what has to happen, and you can see it when you see the Easter Gospels recited, is that in there's always an Easter moment. There's always a moment, and it comes at different places. It's kind of interesting. It's why the Gospels are so interesting. There isn't one solid story. It says, this is what happened. It comes at us at different angles, and it's nuanced. You know, as slowly the disciples and those around Jesus sense he is not dead, he is alive. And it comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes through the gospel stories of Easter. So, Easter morning, sure, you're all in church to celebrate. That's a mandatory thing for Christians. You've got to be there for Easter, and every Sunday if possible, to worship God. But Easter morning, we saw Mary have her Easter moment. When we heard the gospel, possibly, in most places, it's the gospel from John, and Mary goes to the garden. You remember this, one of the most famous moments in the Scriptures. And Mary goes to the garden. It might have been, we've had some beautiful mornings lately, haven't we? Right around Easter, we have great mornings. I fantasize, that was what the most beautiful morning we've had this spring. That's what it would have been like Easter morning. Good Friday, the sun couldn't have shone. I don't know what happened, I wasn't there, but it couldn't have shone. It must have been dark and foreboding and depressing. Big clouds, right? Get that sense. That's what it must have been like. And just the opposite on Easter morning, when Mary went to the garden tomb, she must have, the birds would have been singing. We live by the place where we hear the birds singing, and the frogs are making all kinds of noise now. I fantasize that must have been what it was like when Mary went to the tomb Easter morning. The sun was coming up. It was almost coming up. And she goes to do what you do when a loved one has died and hasn't been prepared properly. So she's going to do the ritual thing. No expectation, no anticipation. Her heart would have been very, very heavy. And she went to the tomb, and we know the story. The tomb is not there, and she sees eventually a person she supposes to be the gardener. And here's the interchange. Here comes her Easter moment. Jesus says she thinks he's the gardener. And it comes in like the Easter moments come kind of not directly, they kind of come this way, in an indirect way. And so here it comes. He says, Mary. And she says, Rabboni. That's her Easter moment. She sees what God has done in that moment. And her life is changed forever. She's transformed into the resurrection. She couldn't possibly be the same person. Of course, she went back and seen the Lord. They didn't believe her, remember? She's a woman, right? They didn't say that. They did, right? The guy said, well, she's a woman, and well, she is a woman, and she was the first one to see Christ risen. That's what she is. Anyway, later on that night, if you were in church, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up. If you were in church last week, for Low Sunday, you would have heard the gospel tell us two Easter moments.